Samuel, probably butchered this, Dupret. And Samuel is a researcher at the Happier Lives Institute, where he is researching the cost effectiveness of various methodologies to increase subjective well-being. He has a master's from UCL, where he did work on decision-making and cognitive sciences, and has a bachelor's from Southampton, where he studied psychology. So with no further ado, Samuel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. You are here because you care about doing good. You care about making a difference, and you want to use evidence and reasoning to inform how you're going to do this good. So I'm going to present the work we do at the Happier Lives Institute about what is good and how to cost-effectively improve good in the world, and hopefully make you better consumers of this information to help you make a difference. Let's start straight in with an example. Imagine you have $1,000. Maybe it's the money you want to give to charity. Maybe it's the resources of your institution. Maybe it's your foreign aid budget, a very small one. And you could use that money to do a range of different things. Maybe you'd send a $1,000 cash transfer to family poverty and double their income. You could use it to treat 50 people with depression in Uganda. You could use it to provide deworming medication to 1,000 children for a year. Or you could use it to save a third of a life with 200 anti-malaria bed nets. And these are very different interventions. How can we compare them in order to know where to allocate our resources? And we've been talking a lot about cash transfers. Rory Stewart was here yesterday. He works with Give Directly. And cash transfers are considered a reference, and that's why I mentioned them here. They're kind of the gold standard in charity recommendations and aid. And they work, they do good. And if your intervention is worse than just giving people money, it's probably worth considering that. But you can imagine situations where interventions would be better than cash. If people can't or won't access things that would be really good for them. For example, in certain countries you can't just go out and access psychotherapy. Or if you need coordination, you can't just solve regulating lead exposure in different products by giving people cash transfers. But the fundamental question is, what does it mean to say that cash transfers do good? What is the outcome that we're comparing things on? What does it mean to do the most good possible? At the Happier Lives Institute, we think of it this way. Usually when you look at an evaluation of how good something is, people will tell you about how much income is produced or how many people are treated. Income and health, they are good things, but they are instrumentally good. They are good for a reason. Why is it good I have money? Well, I can buy things. Why is it good I can buy these things? Well, they provide this and that. And if you ask yourself that question far enough, you start getting to what ultimately matters and what philosophers call well-being. How people think and feel about their lives, how happy they are. You get to the point where it's just, this thing is just good in itself. Now, there are quite a few different theories of well-being. I'm not going to go into them. They all have strengths and limitations. But I mentioned that you can have like a Christian version of all of these theories. And when I mention something that is a Christian version of something here, just note that my employer is not Christian, and so it doesn't represent their views. This is just me. So I think you can have a Christian version of most theories of well-being, and Christians can disagree about these, but I think at its core, one thing we can agree about is that perfect well-being is not for this time, it's for the new creation. And maybe the strongest limitations to focusing on well-being is that Jesus said we will suffer if we follow him. So I'm going to say a lot about well-being, a lot of positive things, but I would note if someone told me, oh, this person converted in Afghanistan and now they're persecuted, their well-being, their happiness, their life satisfaction is down, I would still think that it's better for them that they have a renewed relationship with their creator. So still, I'm going to make a good case for well-being, don't worry. Here at this conference, we don't only want to think about what ultimately matters, but what ultimately matters for Christians. I think the Archbishop makes a very good case in dethroning Mammon that what we measure controls us. And currently in the world, what we measure is GDP, is income. The center of everything we do is based on money, and I think well-being is a much better alternative here. Perhaps you think, well, there's other stuff I care about than well-being, and we could discuss whether actually that's just a determinant of well-being or something like that, but the core thing, I think, is that most people, I hope, agree that happiness is more important than income. How people think and feel about their lives is more important than just how much money they have. We have been talking a little bit about this framework that we might have in circles like these about maximizing well-being, about being a bit utilitarian. I think we can put constraints on that are quite helpful for Christians. This is just my way of doing things, which is probably philosophically unsophisticated, but you can think of, well, first, am I following all the commands? Then, am I going to be more like Christ? And once all of these things are satisfied, then I can go in and just think about the consequences. Like, I thought of 2 charities. There's no thing about these charities that make me think, oh, as a Christian, I have a wider concern about these, and now just think about how much good they do in terms of well-being. And also, there's a point where many of us will be working in the secular world, and so we need to have a point of synergy. We can't just go to all the secular world and say what I care the most about is converting the most people to Christianity. There's a point where we can interact with the world in other ways. Okay, so I've talked about well-being being the ultimate good we care about, but how do we measure it? Once you have your good, you have to measure it in order to model what things does the most good. And so some people, what they do is that they care about well-being, but they look at all of these instrumental goods and then they make guesses about how good these things are. This is a good case of this is give well with their moral weight. They say, like, money is worth this much moral good, a life is much moral good. Instead, I suggest that you should just directly measure the thing. If I want to know your well-being, instead of looking at your income and your health record, I'll just ask you, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 0 to 10? This is not something we've invented or something that's weird. These are recommended questions from the OECD. The work of subjective well-being measurement has been a growing area in the social sciences for the past few decades. And so this is something people do and can be done. And now I'm going to make the case of, should you trust self-reports or should you trust decision makers' educated guesses? You shouldn't trust decision makers' educated guesses because humans regularly fail at predicting how they would think and feel in different situations. And a good case for this is a Dolan Metcalfe study where they asked people to do time trade-offs. So time trade-offs is the basis for the QALY. You might know that in health economics. So you ask people who generally don't have a condition how many years of their lives they'd be willing to sacrifice in order to avoid a certain condition. So it's a hypothetical question. And when people do that, on average they think that having a mild mobility problem is just as bad as having a mild mental health problem. When you ask people to report, who have these conditions, to report their well-being, actually a mild mental health problem is much worse than a mild mobility problem. So people fail at predicting how they would feel in certain conditions, and they underestimate how bad mental health can be for them. Instead, I suggest you can trust self-reports because they're not guesses. We're directly asking the people to self-report their well-being. And this is an area of research that's growing. The UK Treasury has a whole guideline on how to do cost-effectiveness analysis using well-being, and you have all of these different centres working on these things. And these measures are statistically validated, they're reliable, they don't just give a random answer every time you use them, and they're valid, they're concurrent with things you expect of them. So for example, if you look at a map of life satisfaction across the world, you see that the countries that have more resources and few issues and conflicts tend to be more satisfied in blue than others in red. Another thing that's good about well-being is that if it's the outcome that matters, that ultimately matters, and it's the integral of all the things that affect you, of all of these determinants, then if you're measuring that, you're not missing out on something. But if you're just looking at income and health and different points, you might be missing out on something very important in determining how much good your intervention does. So if you do an intervention to reduce loneliness and you don't measure the impact and the good that new social relationships would come from, and you just measure income, then you're missing out on the good that your intervention is doing. We use a common unit at work called the wellbeing, not this wellbeing, the wellbeing adjusted life years. The wellbeing adjusted life year is a 1-point increase on the 0 to 10 scale for about a year. I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. So here on this graph you have wellbeing and you have time, and it's a way of integrating time and well-being. In blue, you have the well-being over time of the individual without the intervention, and in red, you have their well-being with the intervention. So one well-being is a 1-point increase for 1 year, and so this whole red area are all the well-beings you've produced. So we care about well-being, and we put them in this common unit of well-beings, and this is the approach we use at the Happier Lives Institute, which I'm going to present. But briefly, I'll summarize that the advantages of well-being is that it's what ultimately matters. It captures all the important elements into a common unit, and it's not based on guesses from decision makers. So it's a good framework, and now I'm going to tell you about how we apply this framework at work. There's a lot of stuff that goes into doing an analysis at the Happier Lives Institute, but the core thing is that we are using the right outcome. We're using well-being. And I'm going to very briefly walk you through all of these. First, we care about cost effectiveness. So we don't have infinite resources, we can't fund everything, we have to make decisions. And so we want to know how much an intervention costs and how much good it does, and so I'm going to present results in terms of the cost to produce a well-being for each intervention. As a reference point, the UK Treasury values one well-being at about £13,000. It changes time to time, but that's the reference point for the rest of this presentation. And here are the costs per well-being of the different interventions that presented earlier. I'm going to walk you through them. First, let's start with cash and psychotherapy because we have a lot of data about them. What we do is we go into the literature and we find every randomized controlled trial, the gold standard for causality. We extract data from these trials and then we run a meta-analysis to determine the effect on well-being of these interventions. You can see that there's like almost 50 RCTs for cash transfers, 80 RCTs for psychotherapy, so there's a lot of data there. We don't just care about the effect at a certain point in time, we care about the effect over time. And so we model what happens to people and their well-being over time. And you can see that psychotherapy might have a bigger effect to start with, but the effect dissipates much faster, and so it might have a smaller total effect, which is the area of the triangle. We don't just care about the effect on the individual, but we care about spillovers, about what happens to people around them. So if you treat an individual and improve their well-being, it's very likely that the family around them might also have benefits to their well-being. There's very little research, quantitative research about spillovers for interventions, which is a shame because this can represent an enormous part of the effect of the intervention, and different interventions might have different spillovers. So we take the effects on the individual over time and the spillovers, and then we don't just take that face value, but we have considerations about the data we have. One of the things is the counterfactual, what would have happened otherwise. I mentioned earlier, In Uganda, you can't necessarily just go out and buy psychotherapy. You might not have been treated anyways. We care about internal validity. We do publication bias analysis and these things. We care about external validity. So you might have lots of studies about an intervention in one context, but you're trying to evaluate something in a different context. You have to make adjustments. You have to consider that. And then when you have multiple sources of data, how do you combine them? So once we do all of that, we find that cash transfers, $1,000 cash transfer, has a bigger effect on well-being than psychotherapy for people with depression. But it costs $1,000 and more to send a $1,000 cash transfer. It costs less than $50 to give a course of psychotherapy, and so psychotherapy is 5 times more cost effective. You can treat more people and do more good. Just caveat here, I'm not saying take a random person in sub-Saharan Africa and either give them psychotherapy or a cash transfer or a bed-net or a deworming pill. I'm saying there are groups of people who have depression or common mental health disorders who would benefit from psychotherapy, and as long as there are people there to treat, it would be more cost effective to improve global well-being to fund psychotherapy than $1,000 cash transfers. Okay, what about the other interventions I mentioned? What about deworming? Well, remember when I said we have 80 RCTs for psychotherapy, now we're down to 1 quasi-RCT for deworming. Just one study, a very famous study that people have been using for evaluations of deworming, and we found that there was well-being data in this study that hadn't been analysed. We analysed it, and the results are small and non-significant, and so it's too uncertain about the effect of deworming on well-being, and a lot of money has been spent on deworming, and probably some of it could have been used to do a second study. The thing is, you might not always have a lot of data to evaluate your intervention, so you have to consider how happy you are with uncertainty. Consider general things that you can help bringing into your model. Maybe the wider context is helpful. For deworming, the wider context is a thing called the worm wars, where very clever academics are fighting over null results in the short term of deworming, so that's not really encouraging. On the other hand, I'm very keen on reducing lead exposure, and this, whilst it also doesn't have like a wealth of data, it seems like at least people are agreeing in the same direction, and the data seems to be saying lead exposure bad, take it away. So you can use the context to some extent. Okay, what about anti-malaria bed nets? You can see here that I've presented a range, and because this depends on philosophy, which is usually what most people want to hear when talking about cost effectiveness. The reason why it depends on philosophy is because all of these interventions are primarily about improving life, whilst this one is primarily about saving lives, extending lives. It's about quantity versus quality. And the thing is, when you do these sort of comparisons, some philosophical issues come up, which I'm not going to walk you through. I'm just going to say that they do change the results, which is why I have the range. If you're really keen on them, you can ask me afterwards, or you can read The Elephant in the Bed Net, which is our report on these questions. And I want to make it very clear here that this is not because we're using well-being. These philosophical issues, they will come up no matter how you do your analysis, implicitly or explicitly. Specifically, all of your healthcare systems are doing this trade-off with quantity and quality all the time. And health measures have historically changed some of their views on some of these philosophical questions. So it's not just about well-being, like anything that compares quantity and quality is this. So we tend to focus, as you've seen, on life-improving evaluations. Okay, so I've walked you through all of this. This is how we do our analyses, and as I mentioned, some of these interventions are more cost-effective than others, specifically psychotherapy in low-income countries. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you can do with this framework. First, well-being matters, but very few decisions are based on well-being. I've been in conferences recently where people are debating how do we go beyond GDP in government. There's still too little. So if you are close to decision makers or are a decision maker, please consider using the wellbeing framework. There's still too little wellbeing data, especially for interventions, specific interventions in low-income countries. So if you're someone who measures impact or is running an intervention or charity or funds interventions, please consider adding measures of subjective well-being, 0 to 10 life satisfaction, 0 to 10 happiness, and you've done more than most studies in the world. This sort of research about cost effectiveness in terms of well-being is quite new. So if you want to do more theoretical research about how to measure well-being, or if you want to do more applied research about intervention in terms of subjective well-being, especially spillovers, the effects on the family or the community, that'd be really, really interesting. Then we have concrete recommendations. So if you want to give to charities in a cost-effective way to improve global well-being, we specifically recommend psychotherapy in local countries. You can go to our website and follow through there. I mentioned also that we have a bunch of upcoming new reports that seem quite about interventions that seem quite cost-effective, although there's a lot less data here. So we're imagining the trade-off between strong evidence but also cost-effectiveness. And if you're interested in all of that, please stay in touch with me or the Active Lives Institute for our newsletter. But also, we have a seminar next Thursday where you can get a sneak peek at all the research we've been doing this year that will start being published in the coming month. So if you go on our website now, you'll be like, oh, Sam promised all of these things, but not here yet. But if you come to the seminar, you will learn about them. And I have pretty free pieces of paper here if you want to have a physical reminder of the seminar. Okay. My key takeaways. If there's anything you remember from this presentation, these are it. Well-being is the outcome that matters and it's evidence-based. We can use well-being to compare the cost-effectiveness of very different interventions. And this provides concrete recommendations and new insights and hopefully makes you newly informed doers of good when you go forward and do good in your life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. As a reminder, you can ask questions on Slido, and you can also upvote questions on Slido so that we ask your favorite questions. For people that don't know what Slido is, because I'm just seeing some confused looks. It is a cool website where you can ask questions. It's in the description of the talk if you click more. The first question we can ask, which we already have, is how do you provide therapy to people when there's cultural hesitancy or therapy is seen as a drastic measure for people with mental health issues?
So the charities we've evaluated are Strong Minds and Friendship Bench. They work, so Strong Minds works in Uganda and Zambia, Friendship Bench works in Zimbabwe, and they involve staff and people from these countries who understand the situation, and so they know to communicate and figure out what it means to be depressed in a context that doesn't necessarily have the words to express it in the same way that we would here. Part of how they deploy psychotherapy is that they work with community health workers in the community to go out and find people. People come to the hospitals and they might have a problem, and then they ask like, oh, do you experience this or that? Like too many thoughts, all these sorts of headaches and these things. And then they're shuffled to some tests to see if they might indeed have common mental health disorders, and then they're provided access to the program. One of the things that these charities do is that they task shift. So there are very few clinicians, expert clinicians. We think there's too few here in the UK, but there are even fewer there. And so what they do, and this is cost effective, is that they have clinicians train community health workers, peers, people who have gone through the program, to deliver a manualized version of the program to people, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. We model that reduces the effect a little bit, but it reduces the cost much more, and so it's cost effective. So also if you're keen to hear more about how people do this on the ground, because we are analysts who do secondary analysis, I recommend you look at Strong Minds, Wrench and Bench. We do not evaluate Vida Plena, but you might know Joy Bittner from Vida Plena. She deploys a similar program in Ecuador.
We're getting lots and lots of questions, which is amazing.
Okay.
The question which is getting lots of light is, as a Christian, do you think it's ever justified to do good that is not cost effective? Like the woman and the jar of expensive perfumes.
Give me a minute. I've seen this question in quite a few slides before. Alice, come up to me. Yeah. So I think there are two ways in which I would answer yes to that question. One is, yesterday there was a presentation about what does it mean to be an effective altruist. Is it too utilitarian for Christianity? And this was about, it's not about the kind of radical, complete, I just care about the greater good for the greater number. It's about increasing the share of the resources we have, be it time or money, etc., that we want to cost effectively and impartially use for good. And so it's just like a psychological reality that we're not necessarily going to manage to do lots of that, but also as Christians we do believe that we have perhaps duties to a family or people close to us, or that we've been set in a specific place to do a specific thing. Second thing is, you might be just called to do something that you think might not be cost effective, but the ultimate perceiver of the good we do and whether it's cost effective or not, it is God, and so that, he's the one in charge. And finally, perhaps just that glorifying God and what happens with the jar is maybe the most cost-effective thing. I'm not saying this means like music concerts that are Christian are like cost-effective. I just mean that in the end, this is the thing that matters. So if your calling is to work in a specific area and that glorifies God, then that's a good thing.
Another hot question is, and this is something of a statement here as well, that self-reports are highly subjective.
Yeah.
That is, one person's 7 will be very different from another person's 7. And so, how can you then consider them in a concrete, as a concrete enough measurement to be like a quantitative research?
So, very good question. People are paying attention. So subjectivity is not a dirty word. If well-being is something you experience, you're the person who has that information. That's why I kind of mentioned with the guesses. Like if a decision maker is like, oh, this person has money, but they're miserable. Like they shouldn't be miserable. I'm not going to care about that. It's like, oh, but probably they have depression and need something else than money to help them. In this question, there was something about comparability, which is a really good question. Like, are we using these scales the same way? And not like, it's possible that things affect us in slightly different ways, and that's okay, that's just our well-being. But it's possible that we use the scale in different ways, and that would be a problem. If you're interested in that, we have a report. It looks like my name is in this, but this is not my name. This is the surname of a co-author. We have a report exploring comparability, linearity, and neutrality. These are interesting questions. Overall, for now, it seems like comparability would hold. As I showed you the graph of life satisfaction across the world, and it's like, it makes sense. Like, sub-Saharan Africa aren't saying like, yay, we're 7 out of 10, everything's great. So for now, it seems like we can trust these measures. Also, these are the subjective measures that have been the most like tested, because it's the only kind of measure where like most people are interested in it. Like depression measures, only psychologists are interested in it, but there's like economists, social scientists, psychology people, government people, they're interested in it. So they're being tested a lot. Like the OECD has like a 300-page guideline on like how to use these measures. So overall, I think comparability holds. Maybe sometimes it doesn't completely hold and we can improve our measures, but it seems like it is doing a good job. And again, your happiness or your life satisfaction is something you know of. That's information only you can report. And that's why we care about it. One thing I would add is that I'm not saying the wellbeing framework is perfect. I'm saying it's good, and it's much better than what we'd have otherwise. It's much better than focusing only on GDP. It's like, what would you care about otherwise?
This fits actually perfectly with another question that I have, which is, do you think measures frameworks like HDR or Kate Raworth's donut theory or UNSDGs are better alternatives than GDPs, or a combination including well-being? And it might be helpful, just like, of course, I know what all of this means.
Okay.
But
did
for
you ask
everybody
that
else,
question?
No, I did not. For everybody else in the room, it would be very helpful to explain what HDI and Kate donut theory and UNSDGs are.
Cool. So the SDGs are a set of indicators that the UN has decided are important. They include all sorts of things: economics, the environment, equality, gender, etc. I don't know what the HDI is off the top of my head.
Is the person who asked this here and can expand?
I can't remember it because I haven't come across it in a while, but I think it's the Human Development Index, which measures well-being or happiness to an extent, and maybe like economic development. But I believe the UNSDGs are more just general comprehensive goals and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's very ambitious, but it's actually our commitments from the resources coming from.
Yes, and in the donut economics that we have kind of planetary constraints on what we can do, and we have core like social core that we care about. Okay, these things I think are good, but usually what proponents of these approaches do is kind of make a category mistake. And there's lots of other, like, there's loads of these things, like in massive panels of indices, like the OECD has one, Eurostat has one. What they do is, like, they're like, okay, these are all the things we care about and we think are good, and we're going to measure them, and then we're going to present them to decision makers, and hopefully they'll use them. Note that some of these are like 8 indicators, some of these are like 100 indicators. The thing is, a lot of these things are determinants of well-being, not well-being itself. So in these indicators, you have consumption, income. Like, that's not well-being. That's a determinant of well-being. So the ordering is wrong. So like, you should have well-being on the one side of the equation, and all of these elements go into well-being. And I'm not saying like, don't measure these things, just measure well-being. Do measure these things because you want to understand the causal story of why the well-being is low or high. So you want to know, like, is it because we have low income? Is it because there's this or that problem happening in the situation. But you still need to decide on what is the outcome you care about. Otherwise, you are hoping for two things. One, that decision makers will be good at weighting these different things, and then you're back to experts making guesses about what's important. Or really hoping that the thing you do just increases everything, and that you don't want to do trade-offs with something else. And you're hoping that decision makers are going to be like, yeah, I care about 8 outcomes, I remember all of them. I'm definitely not just looking at GDP and then hoping these other outcomes kind of link to that. So I agree that these are good things. I think they're better than GDP, but the thing is that we still need to know what the goal is. The goal is well-being. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, Lord Layard, LSE and the Value for Money, they do this sort of thing in the policy level. And recently he was at the OECD forum in Rome telling these people interested in multiple indices, like, the thing that matters is well-being. That's the outcome, the rest are determinants. Yeah, I do think the problem with GDP isn't just that it's one number, it's that it's not the thing that matters. Of course we don't want people to just focus on one number, but I don't make the assumption that politicians are going around looking at 100 indices and being like, I remember all of these and I care about all of these equally, and I'm going to make a really good modelling of how they trade off to each other. That was a bit of a rambly answer to this, but yes, good. A slight confusion between what the outcome is and what the inputs are.
Well, following on what are the good outputs, we have also flagged on a question that asks, can you explain further HLI's position on extending vs improving quality of lives? Does HLI choose not to engage with life extension as a worthwhile cause?
We don't have a view. We don't have a view. We leave it up to individual people to look at the philosophy and figure out what their views are. And I think we don't confuse the public by saying, oh, this is our view and clearly it's objective, like when there's like an element of values and philosophy. And practically, it means that the focus of our research has been on life improving because it's like the quality of life. One, because we don't have to get into the difficult questions, despite us being the people who have raised the difficult questions. But also because a lot of people have already done estimations of life extending, life-saving interventions, so we're focusing on something different. If you're interested in my personal views or how I might argue the different views from a Christian point of view, and whether you personally should care about life-saving, life-improving more or less, I'm happy to chat about that. All of these numbers might change, but you can see that the Z reduction for now is more cost effective than even the lower bound of anti-malarial bed nets. So even if we have a range of philosophical views, some interventions we just think, that could be better. The thing with lead reduction is that there's less data. And then here's another thing for you, is like how much do you trade off certainty and cost effectiveness.
In this general framework of decision making, we have a number of questions around well-being.
Yes.
I might group them all together.
Not the Archbishop again. Just
no. Not all well-beings are created equal. That is, 1 point increase between 6 and 7 should be valued differently vs 1 point increase between 9 and 10. How do we account for that? Another question somehow related is, just looking at well-being, would you say that the inequality between West and East is much closer than if we considered GDP? Is this concerning? I guess that might be a question of, even if the absolute difference might not be that big, if there are some big differences between putting more resources in, for example, increasing the well-being in developed countries versus underdeveloped countries. Or maybe it's the opposite way around. And there is also a question, what if increase of one well-being in one group is dependent on a decrease of well-being in another group? How do you compare, especially if well-being can be subjective? So there's lots of questions, and also, will change in well-being, can it be measured and compared over time for a given person? And is there a challenge to comparing between different people and communities? So all kind of come together in terms of how do we actually engage with the well-being.
Okay, so the last question, I think I answered to some extent with comparability, work like that about, you know, are we using the scale in the same way? So if you're interested in that work, you can look up our work on comparability, other people's work. So Michael Plant, our director, has written different things about that. Alberto Prati, Casper Kaiser work on these sorts of things. And again, I think comparability overall holds. As we refine research and modeling of these things, we might, you know, improve methodology. Yeah. So that question is kind of more comparability. Now, all of the other questions, very, very good questions about how do we distribute the good. So these are kind of moral questions about how do we organize the good in society, and to some extent, this is where you want decision makers. So the first question was about, are all well-being created equal? Assuming, and I think this is also one thing that's being researched, but I think holds, assuming the scale is mostly linear across the scale, like mathematically 4 to 5, 5 to 6, same thing, but maybe morally we want to prioritize certain groups, or we want to prioritize people who are at the bottom of the scale. So that's being a prioritarian, instead of doing the aggregation completely agnostic of who gets the benefit. You want to focus on the groups that are at the lower end of the scale. Concretely, for our recommendations, it just increases the cost effectiveness of all our analyses, because they tend to be in low-income countries where people are low on the scale anyways, and where your money goes further. So that's a good question. That's a moral question for you to resolve. Whether you want to be a prioritarian, I think that's a laudable philosophical position. I think you can probably make a very good Christian case for being a prioritarian. So that's a specific distribution of the goods question. Then there were questions about inequality and conflict. Okay, inequality. I haven't directly quantified the difference between inequality in GDP and inequality in well-being, but there is inequality in well-being, as you saw with the map. Like a whole chunk of the world has lower well-being than another chunk, and also that chunk of the world is much more populous. So there are way more people there who are at low level of well-being. Well-being inequality within countries as a kind of spread is also quite big, and that again is both something we should be concerned about in terms of just where we do the good, where it might be cost effective to do the good, but also morally as a decision maker, you might think like, I want low inequality in the outcome of good. I want to prioritize the people at the bottom of the scale and push them up. I think that's a laudable position. And then there's a question about conflict. Sometimes, again, the subjectivity is not the problem here, but sometimes the well-being of some group comes at the expense of another group. I was looking recently, the well-being of Russia tends to go up and the well-being of Ukraine tends to go down. That's bad, but also the GDP of Russia is going up. Why? Because they're incentivizing a war machine. So GDP also goes up when you do bad stuff. The thing here is not to say, well, we don't want well-being because sometimes bad actors get well-being from their bad actions, is that we want extra constraints around. I think any kind of good that you measure is going to have these sorts of externalities where people can get that good by being harmful to other people. And so you want constraints on that. You want to say, I value well-being, but I want well-being through a democratic system. I want well-being that doesn't cost other people. Also, generally, in some situations it's just bad and you want the constraints. Sometimes, if it comes at the cost of someone else, then that can cancel out. Like, if I got like an extra well-be from hitting Piotr here, and he lost one well-be or two well-be's, it would cancel out. Overall, in total, this would cancel out. But in general, we want constraints to avoid that. And that, again, is like the role of decision makers in how we organize society. So, do we value the people lower down the scale? Do we want to tackle misery? Sometimes it might just be more cost effective because your intervention at the low level has a bigger effect. But also sometimes you just morally want to value that more. Do we value inequality? Sometimes it might just be more cost effective because reducing inequality leads to more good. But also morally you care about reducing inequality, and we do want to put constraints on bad actors.
This sounds very similar to the effective altruism problems, and it feels like, I guess, well-being is a very effective altruism type of thing, of something that you can actually quantify, and that of course opens up a kind of world. So if you can quantify, you can hack it.
Yeah, I agree. I'd say that the well-being approach has existed outside of effective altruism and before effective altruism. But yes, when you start quantifying something, you need to deal with some of its issues. I think that even if you don't measure things, you still have these issues. If you're like, oh well, let's just care about general things and hope the decision makers are going to do good things, well, they're still going to cause evil to other people and be bad actors and have inequality, and it's just that we're not measuring it. Yeah.
We also have a couple more questions about the studies. So one question goes, when the studies on well-being are carried out, do participants have an understanding of what well-being is in order to effectively answer the questions? And a similar question, what is being done or what can be done to better account for the spillover effect? What will these studies look like?
Oh, very good question. Okay, so maybe I should just put the map up. Oh, it's far away. Don't use animations. The World Happiness Report, the Gallup World Poll, they asked this question to loads of countries, and they have translations, and they know that people understand that question. Overall, I think in some form or some language, we understand that there's something about happiness or being satisfied with our lives that most people would understand. I think it's you don't want to confuse that for some people different things improve their well-being differently, and that they might have a different definition of well-being. I think most of the time we can get to are you happy or are you satisfied with your life, and there's broken translations like even in the OECD, in the developed countries, we have different languages and different cultures, but people can be asked this question and you can see results that are meaningful. Then it's still the work of monitoring and evaluating that when you ask these questions, you make sure that you have the right translation, you are getting meaningful answers from people, that you're presenting the scale in a good way. If you're dealing with populations who have issues with numeracy, like giving them a scale maybe that they can use, like a physical scale where they can point to, or smileys or something to help get the answer. By the way, this is 2020, this is why some countries you might expect they'd be lower or higher. So there's still work to be done there, but I think very rarely is it the case that it's because there are fundamental differences in how we understand things like life satisfaction. Cantrell designed one of these scales, had a study where he asked people what do they care about in life, what do they want. Most people say the same thing. They want a healthy life, they want to be able to provide for themselves and their families, and there's just basic things that everyone kind of wants and needs. So I don't think we have deep trenches of differences in what affects people. And again, if different things affect people differently, that's just a determinant, that's not the outcome. Spillovers. It would mean surveying with the same question people who are not the recipient of the intervention. So you give a cash transfer to the mother of a household, and you also measure the children if they're old enough. You measure the husband. You try and measure the community if you want. So it's about measuring more people and reporting that data, carrying with that data. That costs more money. That means more time and more consideration at the monitoring and evaluating level. In different contexts, it might be very difficult. If you're doing an intervention to reduce interpersonal violence, it's going to be who are you going to survey for the spillovers? How are you going to, but overall, it's just about surveying more people, specifically people who didn't receive the intervention themselves. It's very rare that people do that. All of the studies we have for the spillovers for psychotherapy, it's not like it's in the abstract or title, it's just we found the paper and saw that they happened to have in one of the tables, we also measured the well-being of their partner. Or one of them is they're not reporting it, but in the data, there's the well-being of the partner, and we can run the analysis on that data because we have access to it. So the starting point is very, very low.
Amazing. In the interest of time, we can combine two questions into one. And effectively, they'll be challenging psychotherapy, it seems, as the best intervention. One question is about, or the first part of the question which we'll be creating is about the nuances of effectively using the $1,000 that we could use for psychotherapy to improve the life conditions, which would mean that person will not get mental health issues in the future. And the second part of the question is effective psychotherapy meaning that people are making peace with the injustices that they should be actually fighting against?
These are good questions. If you have common mental health disorders, you would know that it's not always I'm poor and therefore I'm miserable. Sometimes you have maladaptive thoughts and patterns of behavior that are actually preventing you from engaging in the market and with your family and all sorts of things that you need specific help for. So psychotherapy isn't saying to people like, come to peace with your situation. It's like, there are specific things happening in your life, in the way you think and behave or react to things, that can be changed and help you engage with life in a way that's beneficial for you. So I think often we think of the relationship to mental health as just like you have income and it affects mental health. But actually the relationship is bi-directional. So if you have issues keeping a job because you're going through really severe mental distress and you don't have help to deal with that severe mental distress, you can't keep a job, you can't engage in the economy, you can't have income. So it goes both ways. And specifically, the psychotherapy is targeting people who have these problems and helping them deal with these problems. One of the friendship events deploys problem-solving therapy. So they don't actually tell them like, let's come to peace with things. What are the problems you're facing in life, and how can we make a plan for you to solve them? And from the first session, you're starting like, okay, how can we solve things in your life? Also, I'm forgetting part of the question now, but I'm still going. We live in a society that's actually fairly psychoeducated, so we know a fair amount about mental health and things like that. I think in these places, it's just an enormous boon to be told, no, it's not a demon, and you're not alone, and we can help you with this. Like, imagine you knew nothing about mental health, and you have terrible thoughts going through your head all the time, and you're told, actually, you'll be okay, we can help you, and you're not alone. That is part of it. Again, the cash transfer costs $1,000 and more, and the person might not be able to access psychotherapy. As I said, in these countries, there's no provision other than for mainly these charities. I've got the signal that I should end. So, wellbeing matters, and I hope you're newly informed doers of good. Thank you.